So before we actually get into creating the automation framework, let's answer the most important question, which is why do all this work? Why not just record your tests using Selenium IDE? That seems like that would be an easy way to go, and why do we have to write all this code? Well, there's a few reasons why recording doesn't work. Let's go over some of those. The major reason is test brittleness. So if you look at this simple diagram here, you can see that if you decided that you were just going to record your tests and you weren't going to use some kind of a framework, then your tests would directly depend on your web application. So what happens now if your web app changes in some way? Let's say that the structure of the application changes significantly, or even just minor little changes. Well, if you have a large number of tests and all those tests depend on, let's say, a particular element on a page being named a certain thing, and that changes, all of those tests are suddenly going to break. And now you're going to have to modify that code in all those tests. That's really the big disadvantage of recording, because recording is going to grab the elements as we've seen by the most efficient way that it can find to grab the element, which is not abstracting away that idea of grabbing an element. So if that element changes, all of those tests break. You're copying a lot of code when you're recording. Now, let's think about what happens when we put an automation framework in place. The only modification I've made to this diagram is I've created an abstraction layer. And that's what the automation framework is doing for you. It's primarily giving you an abstraction from the actual web application. Now we'll see in a minute here how we actually still want to model the web application using the page object model. But the idea here is that your tests now depend on this automation framework. You're using the automation framework as a almost internal language for writing your tests. So since your tests depend on that automation framework, if we run through that scenario where something changes in your web app now, then you just have to update the method in your automation framework that manipulates that object in your web app. So for example, let's say that an ID changed, or a name of some field that you're using or an element changed. Well, hopefully you've only created one reference to it in your automation framework. You've abstracted away the idea of how to grab that element or use that element. And so all those tests are depending on the framework. And so you only have to change that in one place because there's not that duplication of the dependencies on your web app. So that's the major reason why we don't want to record. Now, this chart is by no means scientific in any way. This is just an example of some observations that I've personally made working with a lot of different organizations on their automation frameworks and just seeing from experience how things go. What I've found is that recording starts out to be much faster than developing a framework. It's very easy to get going with an automation framework by starting off just doing some recording. In fact, you start off really, really fast. But what ends up happening is because of that test brittleness, and because the tests that you record start to get more and more complex, the time it takes to record starts to go up significantly. And you're not able to reuse a lot of what you've already recorded. So you really don't gain any benefit. In fact, it starts to slow down just because those tests start breaking, and you're constantly going back and re-recording things or modifying tests. Now on the framework side, you start off with a big hit. It definitely takes a lot more time to use a framework or build a framework than it does to record. But as you start building out that framework, as you start building out all the functionality of that framework and really finding ways to make your framework efficient and your tests very succinct, you end up saving a large amount of time. You get to the point where it's very easy to write an automated test because you already have all the supporting framework.